November 8, 1928, 10:30 a.m. Bugs Moran's hand froze on the door handle. Something felt wrong. The SMC Cartage warehouse was too quiet, too still, like a predator holding its breath. 4 minutes later, 7 of his most trusted men lay dead inside, and Al Capone would send a message that would make every gangster in America think twice before challenging the Chicago outfit. But here's what the history books won't tell you. This massacre wasn't about killing 7 men. It was about what Al Capone did in the 48 hours after the shooting that turned a brutal execution into a masterpiece of psychological warfare. What nobody understood that morning was that Al Capone had been planning this moment for 6 months. Every detail calculated, every witness positioned, every escape route mapped. The 7 dead men weren't just casualties of a gang war. They were pawns in Al Capone's chess game that he'd been playing since Bugs Moran first decided to challenge his authority in Chicago. To understand what happened in that warehouse, you need to understand who Bugs Moran was in November 1928. He wasn't just another Chicago gangster. He was Al Capone's last serious rival, the only man in Chicago who dared to steal Capone's liquor shipments, hijack his trucks, and openly mock his authority. For 2 years, Moran had been building his own empire on Chicago's north side, directly challenging Capone's control of the most profitable territory in the city. By late 1928, the war between Capone and Moran had cost both organizations millions of dollars and dozens of lives. Moran controlled the north side. Capone controlled the south side, but Chicago wasn't big enough for both of them, and everyone in the underworld knew that one of them would have to eliminate the other to survive. But there was something Bugs Moran didn't know about Al Capone, something that would cost him everything. Al Capone wasn't just a gangster who solved problems with bullets. He was a strategist who understood that the most effective violence wasn't random brutality, but calculated terror that sent a message so clear that nobody would ever question his authority again. The plan Al Capone devised for November 8, 1928, wasn't just about killing Bugs Moran and his men. It was about doing it in a way that would make every criminal organization in America understand that challenging Al Capone meant facing consequences so severe that the mere thought would paralyze his enemies with fear. "I want Moran and his entire leadership dead," Capone told Jack McGurn, his chief enforcer, during a meeting at the Lexington Hotel. "But I don't want it to look like a gang hit. I want it to look like something else entirely." "What do you mean, boss?" McGurn asked, leaning forward in his chair. "I want the police to think they did it. I want the newspapers to think it was a police raid gone wrong. I want everyone in Chicago to believe that Bugs Moran's crew was so dangerous that even corrupt cops had to gun them down in cold blood." What McGurn didn't understand was that Al Capone was about to orchestrate the most psychologically devastating gang execution in American history. He wasn't just planning to kill his enemies. He was planning to make their deaths look like justice. October 15, 1928. 3 weeks before the massacre, Al Capone made the phone call that would change everything. The number belonged to Abe Bernstein, a small-time crook who worked occasionally for both the Capone organization and Bugs Moran's crew. "Abe, it's Al. I need you to deliver a message to Bugs Moran." Bernstein's voice was nervous on the other end of the line. Working for both sides in a gang war was dangerous, but the money was too good to refuse. "What kind of message, Mr. Capone?" "Tell him I've got a shipment of premium Canadian whiskey coming in on November 8th. Tell him it's worth $50,000, and it's going to be sitting unguarded in a warehouse on North Clark Street for exactly 1 hour." "You want me to tell Moran about your shipment?" Bernstein asked, confused. "I want you to tell him it's not my shipment. Tell him it belongs to Detroit Purple Gang, and they're storing it in Chicago temporarily. Tell him it's the biggest score he'll ever see, and if he hits it fast and clean, he can take the whole thing without a fight." Bernstein was confused, but he wasn't paid to ask questions. He was paid to deliver messages, and the message he delivered to Bugs Moran was exactly what Al Capone wanted him to hear, that $50,000 worth of premium liquor would be sitting unguarded in a North Side warehouse on November 8th. But here's what Bernstein didn't know, what Bugs Moran didn't know, what nobody knew, except Al Capone and Jack McGurn. There was no whiskey shipment. There was no Detroit Purple Gang deal. There was only a trap so perfectly designed that Moran would walk into it voluntarily, bringing his entire leadership team with him. November 5, 1928. 3 days before the massacre, Bugs Moran was in his office above the Biograph Theater, planning what he thought would be the biggest heist of his career. 7 of his most trusted men sat around a table covered with maps of North Clark Street, discussing how to hit the warehouse and escape with $50,000 worth of Canadian whiskey. "It's too easy," said Pete Gusenberg, Moran's most experienced gunman, tapping his finger on the warehouse location. "Capone doesn't leave shipments unguarded. This feels like a setup." Moran shook his head, lighting a cigarette. "Al's in Miami, been there for 2 weeks. I've got people watching the trains and the airports. He's not in Chicago. Besides, the tipster says it's Detroit Purple Gang liquor, not Capone's. They're just using Chicago as a temporary storage depot. We hit it fast, take everything, and they'll never know it was us." What Moran didn't know was that Al Capone had indeed been in Miami for 2 weeks, but he'd returned to Chicago the night before, traveling under an assumed name, staying in a safe house on the South Side that nobody knew about except Jack McGurn. Capone wanted to be in the city when the massacre happened, but he also wanted every witness to believe he was 1,000 miles away. Frank Gusenberg, Pete's brother, looked at the warehouse address on the map. SMC Cartage building. "I know that place. Easy entrance, easy escape routes. If the whiskey's really there, we can be in and out in 10 minutes. "Then we do it," Moran said, stubbing out his cigarette. November 8th, 10:30 a.m. 7 men, 3 cars, and the biggest score any of us has ever seen. But as Moran's crew planned their heist, Al Capone was planning something entirely different. He was planning their execution, and he was planning to do it in a way that would terrify every criminal in America for decades to come. November 7th, 1928, the night before the massacre, while Bugs Moran and his men made their final preparations, Al Capone held a meeting in the basement of the Four Deuces Club. Only 4 men were present: Capone, Jack McGurn, and 2 men who would never be identified by police, but were known in Chicago's underworld as the Cleaners. "Tomorrow morning," Capone said, adjusting the gold watch on his wrist, "Bugs Moran dies. But that's not the important part. The important part is what happens after he dies. The important part is how Chicago reacts to his death." McGurn had worked for Capone for 5 years, but he'd never seen his boss this focused, this calculating. "I mean," Capone said, lighting his signature Cuban cigar, "that by tomorrow night every gangster in this city will understand that challenging me doesn't just mean death. It means death that looks like justice. It means dying in a way that makes the newspapers call you a criminal who got what he deserved." One of the Cleaners, a thin man known only as Detroit Eddie, spoke up. "How do we make 7 dead gangsters look like justice?" Capone smiled, and in that smile was something colder than the Chicago winter. "We make them look like they were killed by police." That's when Capone revealed the most brilliant and terrifying part of his plan. The men who would execute Moran's crew wouldn't be wearing gang colors or carrying unmarked weapons. They would be wearing authentic police uniforms and carrying official Chicago Police Department guns. They would walk into that warehouse looking like law enforcement officers conducting a legitimate raid. "The witnesses will see police uniforms," Capone explained, blowing smoke toward the ceiling. "The newspapers will report that corrupt cops killed Moran's crew during a botched arrest. Everyone will assume it was dirty police work, not gang warfare. And I'll be 1,000 miles away in Miami with a perfect alibi." McGurn was staring at his boss in something approaching admiration. "But what about the real cops? What happens when they investigate?" "The real cops will find 7 dead criminals with long arrest records and histories of violence. They'll find evidence of a gang meeting gone wrong, and they'll be happy to close the case as quickly as possible, because nobody wants to investigate dirty cops killing criminals." November 8th, 1928, 10:25 a.m., Bugs Moran was running 5 minutes late as he approached the SMC Cartage warehouse. The November wind was cutting through his wool coat, and his breath came out in white puffs in the cold morning air. He could see his men's cars parked outside, which meant the crew was already inside, probably loading the whiskey into trucks. As he walked toward the building, Moran felt the excitement that came with a perfect score, the kind of heist that would fund his organization for months. But as he reached for the door handle, something stopped him. A black sedan was parked across the street, and in the driver's seat was a man Moran didn't recognize. The man was reading a newspaper, but there was something about his posture, something about the way he occasionally glanced at the warehouse, that made Moran's instincts scream danger. For 5 years, Bugs Moran had survived in Chicago's underworld by trusting those instincts. He'd learned to read the signs that separated legitimate business from deadly traps. Right now, every nerve in his body was telling him to walk away. Something's not right, he muttered to himself, backing away from the building. He would later tell police that he'd received a phone call that morning, a last-minute change in plans that required him to be elsewhere, but the truth was simpler. Bugs Moran was alive because he'd learned to recognize the smell of a trap. At exactly 10:30 a.m., as Moran disappeared around the corner, 4 men in Chicago Police Department uniforms walked into the SMC Cartage warehouse. The 7 members of Moran's crew looked up from their card game in surprise, but they weren't particularly worried. Police raids were common in Prohibition-era Chicago, and most cops could be bought off with the right amount of money. "This is a raid," announced the lead officer, showing his badge. "Everyone against the wall, hands up." The 7 men complied without resistance. In their minds, this was just another shakedown, another corrupt cop looking for a payoff. They had no idea they were looking at their executioners. What happened next took less than 60 seconds. The 4 police officers ordered Moran's men to face the wall with their hands raised. Then, on a signal from the leader, they opened fire with Thompson submachine guns, killing all 7 men in a barrage of bullets so intense that some victims were hit more than 20 times. But here's where Al Capone's psychological masterstroke became clear. After the shooting stopped, the 4 gunmen didn't flee like typical gang killers. Instead, 2 of them put their hands up while the other 2 arrested them, marching them out of the building at gunpoint. To any witness watching from across the street, it looked like a police raid that had resulted in a shootout, with some officers arresting other officers who had opened fire. By the time real Chicago police arrived at the warehouse 20 minutes later, they found 7 dead men, dozens of spent shell casings, and no witnesses who could identify the killers. The staged arrest had been so convincing that neighborhood residents told police they'd seen officers arresting other officers after the shooting. But the massacre itself was only the beginning of Al Capone's master plan. What he did in the 48 hours after the shooting was what truly terrified Chicago's criminal underworld and established his reputation as the most psychologically sophisticated gangster in American history. November 8, 1928, 2 p.m. While Chicago police investigated the massacre, Al Capone was sitting in his hotel room in Miami Beach, reading newspaper reports of the shooting over the phone. To anyone who might have been listening, he sounded shocked and concerned about the violence in his hometown. 7 men dead? Capone said to the hotel manager who had brought him the phone. "That's terrible. Chicago's becoming a dangerous city. I'm glad I'm down here in Florida, away from all that violence." But privately, Capone was already implementing the second phase of his plan, controlling the narrative. Within hours, Capone's people in Chicago had contacted every major newspaper in the city. The message they delivered was subtle but clear. The 7 dead men were dangerous criminals who had been killed while resisting arrest during a police raid. Those men were bootleggers and killers. Capone's spokesman told the Chicago Tribune, "The police did what they had to do to protect the public." Mr. Capone, who is vacationing in Florida, is saddened by the violence but grateful that law enforcement is finally taking action against criminal elements in Chicago. By the evening of November 8th, the narrative was set. This massacre wasn't a gang execution. It was a police action against dangerous criminals. And Al Capone, who was obviously in Florida at the time, had no connection to the incident whatsoever. But Capone wasn't finished. The third phase of his plan was designed to send a message to every gangster in America, a message that would ensure no one would ever challenge his authority again. November 9th, 1928, the day after the massacre, Chicago's criminal underworld was in chaos. The sudden, brutal execution of 7 of Bugs Moran's top men had left the North Side organization leaderless and terrified. But what terrified them even more was the realization that the killings had been carried out by men in police uniforms, which meant that either the Chicago Police Department was completely corrupt or someone had the resources and connections to stage a fake police raid. Either way, the message was clear. Whoever had ordered the massacre had power that extended far beyond the typical gang warfare that plagued Prohibition-era Chicago. This was something new, something more sophisticated and more terrifying than anything the underworld had seen before. That's when Al Capone made his move. Still in Florida, still with a perfect alibi, he began reaching out to gang leaders across the country. Not to threaten them, not to demand tribute, but to offer them something they desperately needed: protection from the kind of fate that had befallen Bugs Moran's crew. What happened in Chicago could happen anywhere. Capone's representatives told gang leaders in New York, Detroit, and Kansas City, "But it doesn't have to happen to you. Mr. Capone is offering his friendship and protection to organizations willing to work with him rather than against him. The offer was simple. Pay a percentage of your profits to the Chicago outfit, follow Capone's territorial rules, and you'll never have to worry about waking up to find men in police uniforms at your door. Refuse the offer, and you might find yourself in the same position as the 7 men who had died in the SMC Cartage warehouse. Within a week, gang leaders from across America were traveling to Chicago to meet with Capone's representatives. Not to challenge him, not to negotiate as equals, but to pay tribute and ask for protection. The massacre had accomplished what years of traditional gang warfare couldn't. It had made Al Capone the unofficial emperor of American organized crime. November 15, 1928, 1 week after the massacre, Al Capone returned to Chicago as a hero, not because he'd key. This if story of calculated brutality and psychological mastery shocked you, hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who understands that the most dangerous criminals aren't the ones who kill without thinking, but the ones who kill with perfect precision. Drop a comment below. Do you think Al Capone crossed a line with the St. Valentine's Day massacre, or was it just business? Remember, in the world of organized crime, it's not about being the strongest, it's about being the smartest. And Al Capone proved that the deadliest weapon isn't a gun, it's a plan that nobody sees coming,